Good evening, everybody. My name is Dennis Marburger, and I am the host for Curmudgeonly Conversation, where we've had a series of interviews with very distinguished guests on various topics. And tonight, we're very pleased to be speaking with Dr. Richard Ebeling. Now, our program is being recorded. It will be available at ji1776.com on the Cerebrus Radio Network, thanks to the good work of our friend Suzanne Sherman, and soon will be available at the Libertarian Institute. So we're very pleased with that. And tonight we're extremely honored to have Dr. Ebeling with us. Some of you who are watching this will know who he is. He is a distinguished scholar. He spent a lot of time right here in our own beautiful state of Michigan as a professor at Hillsdale College, where he was the Ludwig von Mises Professor of Economics. He was also a professor at Northwood University. He's the former president of the Foundation for Economic Education. He is currently the BB&T professor of ethics and free enterprise leadership at the Citadel in South Carolina. And Dr. Ebeling is a very prolific scholar who has done a lot of work both in terms of videos and in writings and in books. And we're looking forward to a very uplifting and informative discussion with Dr. Ebeling. Dr. Ebeling, welcome to Curmudgeonly Conversation.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you. I love curmudgeons.
Great. Curmudgeons unite, we say.
Exactly.
Thank you. Very good. Well, there's so much to talk about, and so much of your work that we admire. I thought we might start by noting a historical thing that happened today. President Donald Trump congratulated the Communist People's Republic of China for their 70 years of existence, which is a little bit of a sad note, because the existence of many Chinese people was either shortened or ended by that People's Republic of China, that even today has some problematic aspects in terms of what they're doing in their own country. But also, on a happier note, we recently, and you noted this in an excellent piece that you wrote, we recently observed the 70th anniversary of the great tome, Human Action, written by the outstanding leader, perhaps the ultimate, and I think, yes, the ultimate Austrian economist himself, Dr. Ludwig von Mises, whose birthday we just observed a couple of days ago. Perhaps you could share with us some of your thoughts. I know this is a very wide topic and a lot to be said about it, but some of your thoughts about Dr. von Mises and human action, and some of the ways it might inform us going forward.
Well, Ludwig von Mises, for maybe some viewers and listeners who might not be familiar with him, was a famous Austrian economist. He lived from 1881 until 1973. He was about 92 years old when he died. And in the context of what we're talking about, one of his great claims to fame was that in 1920, shortly after the Russian Bolshevik communist revolution in Russia, and Lenin's government started implementing and trying to institute a form of socialist central planning, Mises came up with this essay and then expanded into a full book on socialism, in which he basically showed why a socialist economic system could not work. He said, let's set aside the motives of those who want to set up the regime. Let's, for the sake of the argument, assume that they're benevolent individuals. They only care for the goodness of their fellow men. And we assume that they will be, and people in such a socialist society, again, just as a working hypothesis and assumption for the case of the argument, let's assume that everyone will be as industrious and hardworking under a collective situation as normal self-interest in a private property environment. Now, even if this was true, by nationalizing the means of production, no more private ownership of land, machines, farms, equipment, factories, and the government becomes the single employer of everyone. It's the monopoly, it's the only game in town. What that system does away with market prices. And prices are essential for rational decision making. The world is complex with many different ways of doing things. And we need to have a common denominator, like a common denominator for complex fractions, if you will, that we can then use to decide what is it that people want and how much do they value it, expressed in the money prices they'd be willing to pay. At the same time, goods don't fall from heaven. They have to be produced. We use land, labor, capital, and it takes time. So how do we know whether making something is worthwhile enough, as opposed to using those scarce and limited resources to doing something else? Well, market prices provide us that too. Businessmen compete against each other, hiring workers, purchasing machines, borrowing capital, investing in resources and raw materials to make products. And the businessmen are competing with each other based upon what they think consumers want and based upon market prices, what they think the consumers might be willing to pay. So these prices now form as the common denominators to know and make reasonable informed judgments about the value of outputs, the consumer goods we might want to buy, and the value of inputs, the resources and raw materials and labor skills with which they could be manufactured. So relative to this expected selling price, if this is the cost that I'm going to have to incur to produce something, would it result in me earning a profit or a loss? If it's a profit, is there a way that I can combine more machines and fewer workers, or less sophisticated machines and a few extra hands of workers, some different combinations that would minimize my costs, given the value of these things in alternative productive uses in the society? And Mises said is that is done away with socialism. If all of these means of production are nationalized, then there is, at least legally, nothing to buy and sell. If there's nothing to buy and sell, there's no higgling of the marketplace. If there's no higgling of the marketplace, there's no negotiations and agreed upon terms of trade. And if there's no agreed upon terms of trade, there's no prices. And if there's no prices, how do we know what anything is worth? And should we produce it? And is it more valuable someplace else? And how do we do anything rationally in the economy? Now, it seems mundane compared to, tyranny and murder. But the fact is that goods have to be produced. Resources have to be used. Are we going to have prosperity and growth, or stagnation and mismatching and inefficiency? So that was Mises's point. Even if the communist leadership were like angels, and if everyone was still as motivated as under private enterprise, the fact is, institutionally, you don't know what to do. And you're going to result in economic chaos, stagnation, and instability and mismatching of everything. That's why, for example, in a later little book, he gave it the title Planned Chaos. Planning doesn't lead to rationality and prosperity. It creates to stagnation, mismatching, and poverty. And Mises was right. So when we see that the Soviet Union fell in 1991, the end of the Soviet Union, I traveled there a lot in the last years of the Soviet Union. I was doing consulting work on market reform and privatization. Since the system was getting weaker and likely to crumble, how do you privatize government factories? What do you do with collective farms? How do you make them private farms? What do you do with government-owned and operated apartment buildings? How do you privatize those in terms of condos, or just the building is someone's private property? Just, not easy. But the fact is, I was traveling there. And the system was an economic basket case. Government retail stores, right? Because there was no private businesses, loaded with goods that were of the wrong size, the wrong qualities that nobody wanted, wasted production. And then others were stores, clearly for the goods that people wanted, whether clothes, shoes, food, where the shelves were empty. It was this absolute chaos. And that was in Moscow, the capital of the evil empire, the showcase city. And it was even worse throughout the rest of the country. So regardless of everything else, the system was economically crumbling for the very reasons that Ludwig von Mises had demonstrated near the beginning of this communist experiment in Soviet Russia.
Well, he called it the socialist calculation problem.
Yes, economic calculation. How do you know what things are worth and what should be produced?
Okay, and then that book was called Socialism, I believe, that where he discussed that. And
yes,
it was one of his many
English
great works.
translation has the title Socialism, in Economic and Sociological Analysis.
Okay. And then later, I believe it was after World War II, that's when Human Action came out. And that
Yes.
Okay.
His great magnum opus, it's like 900 odd pages, was first published in a German edition in Geneva, Switzerland in 1940.
Right.
Just literally a couple of months before he left Switzerland. It was war-torn Europe. He was living in neutral Switzerland and came to the United States. So the book was published but had no circulation, and obviously not in the German-speaking world because of the Nazis. So after coming to the United States, he rewrote most of it and published it in an English language, different book, if you will, for the most part, called Human Action, A Treatise on Economics, which came out, as you were saying, 70 years ago in September 1949.
Right. Now, this is very interesting history now for our viewers
Yeah.
because you mentioned Dr. von Mises and his wife Margit, they left Switzerland. They
Yes.
had to leave Vienna, Austria earlier. You hear about the Austrian School of Economics.
Yes.
It doesn't have to do with the Austrian government, but it turns out that a lot of these people that were the scholars happened to be in Vienna or right around there. So that,
Yes.
but during World War II, and Dr. von Mises was of the Jewish faith,
Yes.
so there was danger because of the Nazis and what they were doing,
Yes.
and he and his wife had to escape. And then there was concern, apparently, that they would send agents to attack them, perhaps, and try to get their papers. So he had to leave Switzerland quickly, and he left these papers behind. And then there's a very interesting story about where the papers ended up,
Yes.
and the fellow that found them and brought them here. And maybe you can share some of that with us, Dr. Ebeling.
Well, what a great lead-in. I'm going to hire you as my press agent.
Oh, I'd be honored. Thank you.
Okay, in a nutshell, because, when someone has been involved in everything, they could talk about it forever, but I won't. What happened is that Ludwig von Mises had accepted a teaching position in Geneva, Switzerland in 1934 at the Graduate Institute of International Studies, a position that he retained until the summer of 1940 when he came to the United States. Mises had been a bachelor, and he had been living with his mommy in Vienna. And so he went to Geneva, but his mother obviously was living in that Vienna apartment. She passed away in late 1937, and he returned the apartment to the landlord, a very nice apartment building in the center of old Vienna. But from the new tenants, he sublet the room in the apartment that had been his room. He kept his papers, his manuscripts, his correspondence, documents relating to how he made a living. He was not a professor in Vienna. He actually was a senior economic analyst with the Vienna Chamber of Commerce, focusing on regulatory and monetary and fiscal and international trade matters for the Chamber of Commerce for a quarter of a century. All of that was left in this apartment for the most part. He had taken some papers and part of his library to Geneva, because now he's teaching, he have to have reference stuff. So then in March of 1938, Hitler orders the invasion and annexation of Austria. And within a week or two, the Gestapo, being their efficient selves, started looking for people on their hit list. And one of them obviously would have been Ludwig von Mises, as you were emphasizing. He was Jewish, and he was clearly an opponent of all forms of collectivism, whether it be communism or Nazism, both politically and economically. And so they went looking for him. Well, he's safe in Geneva, but they came to this apartment that had been his. And they broke into the room that he had continued subletting from the new tenants, and they carted everything away. All of these things I mentioned: correspondence, papers, documents, copies of his manuscripts, etc., personal, family things. And again, to make a long story short, he presumed for the rest of his life that it was lost, it was destroyed. Either it was destroyed by the Nazis, which with their tradition of book burning would not have been unusual, or perhaps it had been a warehouse, Allied bombing, destroyed that way. Who knew? But to quote from the old Gershwin tune from Porgy and Bess, it ain't necessarily so. It ain't necessarily so. And so what happened is that his papers ended up in the what we now call the Czech Republic, the region of Bohemia that had been annexed by Hitler earlier. And they were stored there with all of the other looted and plundered collections of archival papers and documents, personal papers that the Nazis stole and seized from all over occupied Europe. And so at the end of the war, in May of 1945, this part of what we now call the Czech Republic, Bohemia, was, quote, liberated by the Soviet army with the surrender of Germany. And they fan out in this town where these papers are being held, and they find, if I remember, 23 railway boxcars. And they break into them. All this is paper. All these looted collections, personal papers. Mozart scores in the original hands. Einstein manuscripts, handwritten by Einstein.
Wow.
The archives of the French secret police the Nazis had plundered in Paris after the fall of France in June of 1940. I mean, it's unbelievable. And of course, among all these massive railway cars filled with paper was Mises's documents. So they informed the secret police, the KGB, then known as the NKVD, and the NKVD informed Comrade Stalin, and Comrade Stalin instructed that the boxcars be brought to Moscow and that a special secret archive be built to house them. It was built in the years immediately after the war in a very nondescript brick building, large stone brick building, with just a little plaque on the front. You wouldn't know what it was. And it was this secret KGB archive. Only the KGB and the Soviet Foreign Ministry had access to anything in the building. And there it sat, virtually unknown, until the end of the Soviet Union. Now, my wife and I were in Vienna, Austria, in 1993, and we were talking to a Viennese economist friend of mine who said that a couple of German scholars had been in Moscow looking for material about anti-fascist Germans from before the Second World War. And among the things they found was a reference to Ludwig von Mises. But since he was Austrian and not German, they really hadn't taken the time to pursue it, just that reference. Well, my wife is Russian. We met in Moscow when I was there as a doing that consulting work on privatization. And so she contacted her Russian friends and tried to track this down, no avail. Then in 1996, in the summer of 1996, we were in Washington, D.C., and we ended up going to the Holocaust Museum for a number of personal family reasons. But I then asked one of the archivists who was giving us some assistance, is there any way to find out if there's anything about Ludwig von Mises? And I gave it a thumbnail about who he was and blah, blah, blah. And he said, well, we have our staff member who focuses on Holocaust studies relating to the Soviet period. And he introduced us to her, and he said, by coincidence, I just got a table of contents to a formerly secret archive in Moscow with foreign collections. And so we start going through it. It's like in a spiral binder. Page after page, page after page, page after page. Number 623, Ludwig Mises. But that's all it says.
Wow. Yeah.
Who knows what's there? Now, my wife has a PhD in political science and history from Moscow State University. For many years, she was a senior researcher at the Soviet Academy of Science. She knows how the library and archival systems work. If something is 5,000 pages or less, it's called a file. If the collection is 5,000 pages or more, it's called a fund. Well, Mises is called fund number 623. So there's a lot of something. But what? His rent receipts? His dry cleaning bills? Who the hell knows what's there? But I went back to Hillsdale College. We went. I immediately informed the then president of Hillsdale, George Roach, who had personally known Mises. He had arranged after Mises' death to get Mises's library to Hillsdale. He had gotten the funding to have a Ludwig von Mises chair, an annual lecture series. So he was very excited. He didn't care what it was. It had to be found out. So he arranged for a couple who were good friends of Hillsdale College and very interested in Mises to give a, dare I say, very generous special donation that enabled my wife to then contact her friends to serve as an entree, because now we knew the name of the archive, the address, the phone number, the fax number, etc., to arrange an entree there. And again, to making a long story short, in October of 1996, we traveled to Moscow, and for about 10 days, we were in this archive, and his files had been put together by the secret police, and we went through them and photocopied at a rather high dollar cost. We photocopied almost 10,000 pages of material, because you see, here was his correspondence, his articles, his speeches, his official policy papers for the Vienna Chamber of Commerce, a variety of other personal writings. And so we brought these back to the United States. The news quickly got out about our find, this cache I've never thought lost, Mises documents. And we shortly after that, the Liberty Fund of Indianapolis, Indiana. Liberty Fund is a nonprofit educational foundation that specializes in reprinting classics in Liberty in unbelievably handsome, hard volumes and cheap paperbacks. And they sponsor Socratic seminars on liberty around the world, different facets of liberty. Anyway, so they contacted Hillsdale College and me and asked if we would be willing to have Liberty Fund publish a large selection of them. They'd pay for the translations, and I would serve as the editor of these translations because I can read German, and I would prepare them editorially. And so I did, and they came out over a series of years in 3 volumes, and it's called The Selected Writings of Ludwig von Mises, Volume 1, 2, and 3. Mostly these papers from his archives from both before and between the 2 world wars, giving an insight to him that previously not known. Because, you would say, well, what about Mises' book on socialism? The big armchair theorists, will socialism work? Or, what causes inflation in the business cycle? And he is well known for that. That's his claim to fame. But as I said, he made his living as a policy analyst in Vienna. He was a policy wonk. He had to do the nitty-gritty policy analysis. The good part of these papers are this other side of Ludwig von Mises, not the grand theorist, but the Austrian economist applying Austrian economics to all of these policy issues of the day in the Vienna of his time and in the Austria of his time. And each volume, it has a long introduction by me in which I try to put the essays and the time in its context. And then with annotated footnotes in which I help the modern reader understand people he refers to, events, places. And I hope that makes these essays in each volume much more readable, intelligible, and profoundly interesting.
Well, that's great. It is a great story, how you were able to accomplish all of that. And my understanding is that the papers themselves, they're now on the campus at Hillsdale. Is that accurate still or no?
Photocopies.
I'm sorry?
Photocopies.
Okay.
Photocopies that I acquired.
Okay. So that's interesting to know that they are there. Well, and Dr. von Mises had, the ideas of liberalism, and he was, there's the book, the Last Night of Liberalism, or The Last Liberal Night, or something like that. That was the title. Back then, what he described as the liberal program was one of free market economics and free trade and free movement of people, free movement of capital and that sort of thing, right? All over the world.
He published this book on socialism in 1922, critiquing socialist planning and all of the facets of socialism. Then in 1927, he published, if you will, a follow-up volume, which is just called Liberalism. Of course, by liberalism, he's not meaning what most people in America think of it.
Right.
He meant the old-fashioned liberalism of the 19th century, individual liberty, private property, free markets, free trade, limited constitutional government with impartial rule of law in which everyone has the same civil liberties of personal freedom. That's the liberalism that he is articulating and defending. So in this book, that is the case for liberalism that he presents as the counterweight to the socialism that he has demonstrated is unworkable.
Right. And so that phrase liberalism, it changed in terms of the public perception. In fact, we interviewed Sheldon Richman a little while ago, and he and I were talking about that, and I thought, well, the change happened during the Franklin Roosevelt administration. Sheldon said, well, it actually began a little bit earlier than that. Yes, there has been this change in the way people look at things, but gee, I wonder, Dr. Ebeling, if we might look at that word liberal, and of course, you wrote this wonderful piece at the American Institute for Economic Research about your career as an Austrian economist and a classical liberal, and I'm just wondering, might we reclaim that word liberal? And has anybody done any work, maybe written a book or something that might be able to help us in that regard?
I'm going to send you a $5 bill in a plain, unmarked wrapper because you are a great PR rep. Yes, and here it is, a book by this fellow, Richard Ebeling, for a new liberalism. And by the way, doesn't it look nice? I mean, the cover design.
Yeah.
This is, when it first came out about 6 weeks ago, I said, please judge a book by the cover. It looks nice. But I would like to think that something of value is in between the two covers. but I basically try to make the case for a recapture of the liberal idea and ideal and spirit. And that is the idea of a liberalism that stands for the autonomy and liberty and rights and dignity of the individual, that he is not to be sacrificed for the collective, the tribe, the group, through coercion and force. And I explain the principles of liberalism, a bit of the history of liberalism in general in Europe, in England particularly, and then the spirit of liberal freedom in America in the 19th century, though imperfect because of slavery and other things. And then I go on to explain the economics of the liberal free society. And then I offer critiques of a variety of challenges that continue against a society of liberty. The advocates of the reborn socialism, identity politics, political correctness, the Green New Deal. And so I then critique all of these from this classical liberal or free market liberal perspective. I would hope that for anyone who kindly takes a little bit of time to read through it, that I clarify some things that may be misunderstood or confusing, and help them to look through the fog of so much of these leftist and collectivist re-emergences going on, and to show why they're wrong and why they are dangerous, and why true liberalism should be viewed as the hope for the future.
Well, that's great. I think that's wonderful work you've done, and particularly so needed now, both because of the movements that you referenced, and also for what we're seeing, I guess we'll say from the right, whether it really is or not, but I mean in terms of this reemergence of mercantilism as a popular political force.
Yeah.
Your thoughts on that? Of course, Dr. Von Mises talked about that a lot. I know you've written some excellent work, and along with your colleagues, I'm thinking of Robert Higgs and, of course, Jacob Hornberger, and I'll, unfortunately, I won't be able to think of all the names now, and that's unfortunate because they deserve their credit. But this whole idea of, I mean, Adam Smith, we would have thought had debunked all the mercantilist arguments, right? In 1776, interestingly enough. But whatever is new is old again, or whatever is old is new again, and we have to fight the same battle. We have to reiterate the principles. Perhaps you could speak about that for a little bit.
Well, unfortunately, there is a counter-revolution against international freedom of trade, freedom of investment, freedom of movement that has emerged in Europe and has emerged in the United States. If you will, a neo-mercantilism, an economic nationalism. And the danger and problem with this is that free trade is its principles, that people should benefit by trading with their neighbors when their neighbors can produce things either that they personally cannot or can do it more efficiently and effectively than themselves, and reciprocally offer and trade something that they can do better than that neighbor to make it mutually beneficial. And that truth, which applies to your neighbor next door, to those across town, in the same state, in the same country, in the same continent, is true around the world. The fact is that the globalized economy that has been going on for well over 200 years and has been continuing and is now bringing out of poverty a massive amount of people in what used to be known as the poor and poverty-stricken third world is amazing. It's because of degrees of market freedom, obviously not full free market freedom anywhere in the world, but degrees of free market freedom, and a greater degree of openness, of taking advantage of specialization in international trade. If I can sort of put this in this historical context, if I may, demographers and economic historians estimate that 200 years ago, let's say around 1820, the world population, right? The world population was 1 billion. And out of that 1 billion people, approximately 85 to 90% lived in poverty or abject poverty. That is, you don't know whether you're going to have a meal to eat tomorrow. 85 to 90% of the world's population lived like that, with a total world population of 1 billion. Fast forward to now. There are approximately 7.5, 7.7 billion people in the world, a sevenfold increase. Yet, according to the standard international organizations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the UN, the International Labor Organization. All right. So I'm not like trying to, take evidence from non-mainstream. They all say that we have a situation where less than 10% of the world population lives in poverty anymore, with a sevenfold increase of the people on this planet. And now, why has this occurred? To the extent and to the degree that governments have allowed markets to function and operate, not to self-interestedly search for profits, opportunities, employments, to find ways to better themselves by serving others in a competitive arena. Mankind is being lifted from poverty, something that was only a dream for all of us. And since the beginning of recorded history, a world without poverty is in our reach. If this trend continues, it is not impossible that by the end of this century, that is by the end of the 21st century, poverty as mankind has known it for all time will be gone. That does not mean that everyone will have the same degree of wealth or comfort or ease. There'll be wealthier people, more comfortable people, less comfortable people. But I mean the image that we've seen in all of our lifetime with those ads on TV getting us to make charitable contributions, where you see some starving kid in Africa or South America, emaciated with flies on its face, looking like he's about to die from lack of food. That poverty, if markets are allowed to work the way they have been doing slowly but surely over the last 200 years, will eliminate poverty from this planet. We should be shouting with hosannas about this triumph of the human condition. And a great part of it has been due to human beings allowed to take advantage of trading and investment and buying opportunities with their neighbors in a global community of supply and demand. And what are some people wanting to do? Lock away their countries, raise the barriers to importing goods, trying to sell and not buy. The point is that, I'm a professor at the Citadel, and I tell my students this. I love to teach. I've always enjoyed it. I never get tired of it. But I don't want them to feel offended if I tell them, if the Citadel wasn't paying me to be there, I might not. I work to earn an income. I export my teaching services to import what? Through the money I earn, all the other goods that I desire, which I can't manufacture myself, my food, my clothing, my television, my glasses, the books that I read or I write. I can't do anything. I depend on the division of labor to people to supply me with all of that. I export as the means to buying all these imports. We want imports to be cheaper relative to exports, so the dollar value of what we sell can buy more of the things we want to buy. So for governments, alas, including our own, to now follow this attitude that buying from abroad is bad and we have to better homespun here in America, will at the end of the day make us poorer than we have to be, and will result in inefficiencies and lower standards of living than all of us could have, or could be increasing over time. It is a misguided and wrong-headed policy.
Yes, and you made your description of this was quite apt, and I think both, again, you and Dr. Higgs, and I'm sure others have written on this, but on this point, this misnomer that, for instance, the United States and China trade. No, Americans and Chinese trade within their own countries and with each other, okay? And so the whole idea of the balance of payments and the trade deficit, these are fallacies. They take us in the wrong direction, and they're based on false premises. So it's another example of economic statistics, and probably Dr. von Mises, and I think Murray Rothbard and others have written about this, how the government statistics themselves are harmful because of how they shape the narrative in an erroneous fashion, but also people tend not to understand that if there's an alleged trade deficit here, there's a capital surplus over here, and the two go together. And as you've pointed out, through that trade, the freer it is, the better it is, because of comparative advantage, and it really helps all of us to prosper, and it is a key component in the thing that you mentioned earlier, the diminution of abject poverty and the increasing of life expectancy and the declines in child mortality. In fact, Ryan McMakin just had a wonderful article at the Mises Institute site. You may have seen this. He took this very thing either yesterday or the day before, and it's even since 1990, the numbers are striking and very heartening, very heartwarming. I have this question for you, though, as we see in the background there, all the wonderful books and the pipes and everything. One book in particular, The Road to Serfdom,
Yes.
from Professor von Hayek, and then a concern is, are we in danger of going in that sort of a direction now, and maybe tied in with this point about the all the trade barriers being raised, and some of the other ways in which people are now calling out for the strong leader, for safety and authority over personal
Yes.
liberty. Your thoughts on that, sir?
Unfortunately, a number of the tendencies, politically and ideologically, even culturally, are moving in a more collectivist and therefore threatening totalitarian direction. Uh, on what we say euphemistically, the left, progressives, democratic socialists, they now have had a reawakened discovery of the desirability of socialism. And they've erased, like an Orwellian memory hole, George Orwell's 1984, where, inconvenient facts were eliminated about things in the past. They've eliminated or refused to talk about the history of socialism and government planning over the last century, and the human loss of freedom and human loss of life that such systems entail. I think you mentioned at the beginning, where today was the 70th anniversary, that is October 1, of the founding of the People's Republic of China, Communist China, by Chairman Mao in Beijing, October 1, 1949. How many people did Mao kill in building his socialist utopia? Well, China is a communist country. The archives are not open. But learned Western and Chinese historians estimate that probably it is possible that up to 80 million, that is 80 million people died in the name of building communism. Several millions, if not 10 or 15 million, in government-created famines in the late 1950s and early 1960s. In the Soviet Union, communists from 1917 until the collapse of the USSR in 1991, partly those archives were opened after the fall of communism in the mid-1990s, so Western and Russian historians could go through the KGB files, the Communist Party archives, and as best as they can estimate, as many as 64 to 68 million people were killed by the Soviet regime, under particularly Lenin and Stalin, in the name of building the workers' paradise. I mean, how do you put your mind around those numbers? 68 million, possibly 80 million, all in the name of a higher good that those in political power humanity, that they're willing to discard millions of individuals in pursuit of the dream. And if you look at the Green New Deal, the legislation, you were kind enough to mention some of my articles on the website of the American Institute for Economic Research, AIER. Over this last year, I've had at least 3 fairly detailed articles on the Green New Deal. It is old-fashioned, Soviet-type central planning. They wrap it around democratic choice and participatory democracy. The fact is, you would give government the authority to plan virtually every facet of our lives forever in the name of saving the planet. And how convenient. Those who propose the plan would then have the power and position to be the planners, but of course they're unbiased and disinterested. These are dangerous times. But I just want to, in that context, Ludwig von Mises once wrote an essay called Trends Can Change. It always looks like something is inevitable, but it's not. You and I grew up in the shadow of the Cold War, right? The Soviet Union. Be honest. Did you any more than me expect to see in our lifetime the end of the Soviet Union? At least I thought it would be either a terrible nuclear war or some bloody, terribly destructive civil war within the country. It imploded because of its economic corruption and inefficiency and people's cynicism. Who can believe this nonsense anymore? And it imploded. Did people die in a number of events in the last years of the Soviet Union? Yes, but it was a small handful relative to this monster that came tumbling down. So nothing is inevitable. It looks like these trends are going to go back to socialism. They need not. What it requires are people of integrity and courage and willingness to say what they know to be true in ways that are polite and courteous to attract the attention of their fellow citizens in making the case for liberty against these collectivist trends.
Great words of wisdom there. By the way, speaking of forecasting, it's interesting. Some of the work done by the folks at Elliott Wave International and the Socionomics Institute on this, and Bob Pricker's written about this, how if you could go back in time, like with the railroads, or but all sorts of different things, what do you think you would have foreseen, or what they were forecasting then, and how things actually turned out? And he says there's so many of these things, and we live in a maybe more of a cyclical world in some ways, and folks tend to want to predict the past or think it's all linear when it's not, of course. But the other thing too is, again, on the trade aspect, wasn't that one of the things that Dr. von Mises looked at, and Bastiat too, right? About if goods aren't crossing borders, perhaps armies will, and
Yes.
and so there's a real problem, perhaps brewing here, in terms of potential military conflicts, and we already see, and of course, Jacob Hornberger's written a lot about this, the national security state and how all that developed, and so this seems to be a very worrisome thing. But as you say, the answer to this must be in reaffirming the principles that
Yes.
have led to the wonderful progress that is sometimes not always seen. We might miss the forest for the trees or something. We need to have a wider perspective. It's just part of human nature that we tend to sometimes focus too narrowly on things. But it is encouraging to see these things that have happened. And there's a great tradition of scholars and advocates for these things. In fact, the title of your book, For a New Liberalism, brings to mind For a New Liberty by Dr. Rothbard. And for people that aren't familiar with Murray Rothbard, he's another person that whose work you would find very helpful in reading on these things. So there is much to be done, but there's been great progress made. And if we can somehow get the point across that liberty and human freedom, besides being the morally proper thing, and we can read through all the great philosophers how they explained why this was the case. As Mises pointed out, it's also the
Yes.
practical thing. The principles
Yes.
are practical.
Yes.
Which is,
Yeah. The important thing is to realize that freedom works. The socialists used to make this distinction. Do we rationally and reasonably plan, or do we have social chaos? And a variety of thinkers, such as Ludwig von Mises, the famous free market journalist Henry Hazlitt, they all emphasize it's not a plan versus no plan. The question is, who gets to plan? Shall each individual have the latitude and liberty to plan his own life, the selection of the goals and ends and means that give value and meaning to his life, and to freely select the methods and means that he considers the best ways to get there in voluntary and free and mutually advantageous association and exchange with their neighbors? Or shall one plan be imposed upon all, or at the most a narrow set of political plans by those who assert their right to say that they know better how we should live than we know ourselves, and therefore make all of us confined and straitjacketed into their single scale of value reflected in their imposed plan, versus each of us having the freedom to pursue our own scale of value and the plans that we interact with others to bring them to fruition. One is liberty, the other is tyranny.
very well said. And that brings to mind the video, Keynes versus Hayek. You probably see at round two they had the boxing match, and then the Hayek character says, "Well, I'm not against planning." The question I asked was, "Who plans for whom?" Which is what you were just referring to. Of course, he dealt with that. I mean,
Yes.
Frederick von Hayek talked about it quite a bit. And the other thing I was wanted to point out is think about Bastiat. He of course said the socialists say that because we don't want government doing something, we don't want it done at all, which is false. They would say if we didn't want the government growing the wheat, we wouldn't want people to eat, and that was wrong. So, and the reason I bring this up is, and again, I think what our friend Jacob Hornberger, some of the things he's written about this, and looking at how much socialism we already have in this country.
Yes.
And in ways that some people probably wouldn't recognize, or they would at first question that we're bringing this up. But he's brought it up in terms of, again, the national security state, immigration policy, and things of this nature. And sometimes, if you raise these points, others will say, "Oh, well, it sounds like open borders or something," or what? And you say, "Well, wait a minute. Why can't we have a free market answer?" There probably are some free market answers to these burning questions of the day, where we don't need to have a socialistic government control of the apparatus, but the marketplace may give us the right kind of solutions. Is that possible?
Absolutely. The fact is that down in historical Orwellian memory hole is the history of 19th century solving of social problems. If I can just take a moment to give one example from Great Britain. In the early part of the 19th century, there emerged some associations that became known as the Friendly Societies, which of course sounds very friendly. These were mutual assistance associations. First, offering insurance for death benefits, right? Some worker dies, how is his wife and kids going to live? It soon expanded into retirement pensions, medical insurance, savings accounts to help ordinary British workers to put aside some money to maybe buy, if not during their working years for their retirement, their own home. All of these networks of private insurance through these friendly societies. And the historians who have studied this conclude that by the end of the 19th century, 2/3 to 3/4 of the entire British population were covered by these friendly society private insurance associations and packages. And they also discovered, well, who has it? Well, oh, the rich must have taken it out, or the higher middle class. No, when they looked through the membership tallies, what they discovered is the large majority of the members were the low income individuals or low middle income. Why? Because they were the ones who were most conscious of the fact that if some misfortune fell upon them and their family, what were they going to do? What were they going to do? So instead, they would put part of their admittedly modest salaries into these insurance policies so they and their families would have greater security. Now, what brought an end to this? Well, Lloyd George, who was then prime minister in Great Britain before the First World War, had traveled to Imperial Germany with one of his government members, Winston Churchill, and was amazed. Look what Bismarck and Kaiser Wilhelm have done. They built a welfare state, government social insurance, government medical care. Well, that's what we have to bring to Britain and give it for free. Of course, nothing is free. The government taxes and then supposedly gives it for free. But how could these private friendly societies that depended upon contributions and fees from their members compete with free from the government based upon taxes? So slowly but surely the friendly societies were weakened and pushed to the side because government basically monopolized an offering at a price that they couldn't match because their sources of revenue were taxes rather than the dues from their members.
Right, and then I think we had analogous things happening in this country, right, in terms of these free market solutions to people needing insurance or try to, right, for welfare, before the welfare state. And lastly, and you've been very generous with your time, but also, of course, people could read in about the mid-19th century in England, Cobden and Bright and the Manchester Liberals and their work with the Anti-Corn Law League, and that's great stuff. Maybe for a future discussion or something.
Yes.
But anyway, I want to thank you, Dr. Richard Ebeling, for chatting with us, folks. He's been very generous with his time. Has a wealth of knowledge there, and you should really read all of his work at the Future Freedom Foundation. I think the Mises Institute has some of your things from time to time. American Institute for Economic Research. You can find him on Facebook, and you'll be enriched by reading what he's written and learning from his studies and great scholarship. So, Dr. Ebeling, thank you very much for being here on Curmudgeonly Conversation. As I mentioned earlier, this will be available. I know John Irvine will have this ready to go tomorrow or the next day or something. But here we are at the John and Kathy Irvine Recording Studio. We thank them very much for their hospitality. This will be available on YouTube at ji1776.com, at the Cerberus Radio Network site. Thanks to the great work of Suzanne Sherman. And very soon we hope we will have these videos up at the Libertarian Institute. So all good news there. We look forward to chatting with all of you later. And again, Dr. Richard Ebeling, thank you very much for all you do and for your graciousness and your time tonight, sir.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
You're welcome. I hope we can do it again sometime.
Absolutely.
Thank you.